US President Donald Trump has announced delays in the application of tariffs when it comes to Canada and Mexico. But the reciprocal tariffs that he's announced for other countries, including India, will kick in on the 2nd of April. It's just one of the many questions that the world has been debating ever since Trump took over the White House. For us here in India, there's one perception that Trump means good news for India. And another perception that Trump is unpredictable, will be extremely transactional, and might throw up scenarios that we haven't quite anticipated. To talk about Trump, how his politics are upending global diplomacy as we understand it, we're joined by Dr. Brahma Chellaney, one of India's foremost strategic affairs thinkers. Thank you, sir, for joining us. I read with interest your column in Project Syndicate, which said that the Trump-Modi bromance, that was the headline, will be put to test. Today, as you look at the first few weeks of Trump in office, from an Indian perspective, what's the first thing that you see?
I see a US-India relationship that is beginning to heal, because we had a period under Joe Biden's presidency when this relationship went through increasing pressure. It came under strain for a number of reasons, because bilateral disputes flared. Now we are seeing a trend toward restoring the momentum in the US-India relationship. And I think Prime Minister Modi's visit to Washington was a very good step. It happened very early in the second term of Trump. It allowed the two leaders to personally reconnect. And we are seeing how Trump's pressure on India is working. For example, if you look at India's oil imports for February, suddenly we see imports from the US shooting up. Obviously, the Indian government is seeking to placate Trump by buying more American energy so as to narrow the trade imbalance with the US. This is one indication of how the Modi government is working to ensure that India is on the right side of the Trump administration.
The question is this. There's been a certain amount of flip-flopping by Trump, at least when it comes to Canada and Mexico, on the tariffs. He's announced now that he's delaying those. The stock markets have taken a hit after initially saying that he was going to ignore the stock markets. He's now blaming globalists for the knock that the US stock markets and thus a ripple effect across the world have taken. Do you believe India needs to be concerned about the reciprocal tariffs?
Yes, but let's look at the bigger picture. Let's look at what Trump wants. He wants to wipe out America's huge trade deficit with the world. And India's trade surplus with the US may not be as large as the American trade deficit with China, but it's about $46 billion. Now, America's total trade deficit with the world makes up 4% of America's GDP. But India also has a huge overall trade deficit with the world. Only important economy with which India has a trade surplus is the US. But India's overall trade deficit with the world makes up between 10 to 12% of India's GDP annually. 10 to 12%. That is almost 3 times of America's the deficit to GDP ratio. So for India, wiping out $46 billion trade surplus with the US would cast a heavy economic burden on India. So these reciprocal tariffs that are coming next month, early next month, are going to hit India hard. So India is trying to do what Canada and Mexico have tried to do. And as you can see from Trump's suspension for a month of his latest tariffs against Canada and Mexico, that he uses tariffs as negotiating leverage. So impose, then suspend, impose, and then suspend. But with China, he has not lifted either the first round of 10% tariffs or the second round of 10% tariffs, because his whole trade and foreign policy strategy is centered on China. He wants to move from Europe, the strategic focus from Europe to the Indo-Pacific. And as this defense secretary said publicly, the focus of the US henceforth should be on deterring China. So whether on the economic front or on the military and strategic front, his priority is going to be China.
I want to come to China in just a moment, but I think what you're suggesting is that there will be negotiating room even with India. And just like, he's managed to announce, or the Canadians and the Mexicans have managed to extract some concession from him, you think that that would be the Indian attempt as well? Or you think that this is only the beginning of a negotiating process?
First, India doesn't have that kind of huge trade surplus with the US that Canada and Mexico have. 80% of Canada's exports go to one country, the US. So Trump's tariffs on Canada spell recession for Canada. Any tariffs that Trump imposes on India would cause some economic pain, but certainly not recession and certainly not major fall in India's economic growth trajectory. So in comparative terms, India is better placed also to negotiate, also better placed strategically, because as I mentioned, Trump's focus will be on the Indo-Pacific, and India is central to America's Indo-Pacific strategy. Without India, there can be no Indo-Pacific strategy. As Trump's first term strategy on Indo-Pacific outlined, in his first term, Trump gave India pride of place in his Indo-Pacific strategy. In his second term, India's importance will only rise in the Indo-Pacific strategy of the US. It cannot decrease. So he cannot pressure India beyond a point. Of course, he would like to extract whatever he can from India, and India is vulnerable to pressure. India is vulnerable to pressure because we have a government which doesn't want to admit that it's vulnerable to pressure. And we saw from the first term of Trump how India under Modi actually responded to the Trump administration pressure by suddenly, there was a 4-year period from 2029 for a 4-year period, 2029, 2020, 2021, and 2022, where India's oil import bill from the US shot up dramatically until the Russian invasion of Ukraine opened up cheaper oil from Russia for India. So India is willing to bend, and we've seen that. And India will bend, certainly, to placate Trump. But India is better positioned than Canada and Mexico, and certainly better placed than China, which will be the target economically and strategically of the Trump administration.
Let's come to China. China's response to the tariffs has been to say we will fight to the finish. And that is one narrative that, as you said, Trump's focus is going to be on China. But there's another sort of narrative brewing that Trump is a deal maker. He likes to do the unexpected. And if nobody could have predicted that Trump today, could be accused of being pro-Putin, as he has been by certain quarters, Trump could possibly look to cut a deal with China. Do you believe that, or do you believe that China will remain a prime adversary in terms of his attention on Beijing?
First, I don't think he is pro-Putin. He's trying to cut America's losses in the Ukraine war. The thing is this, that unless the Ukraine war does not end, the US cannot shift its strategic focus from Europe to the Indo-Pacific. Now, after more than 3 years of this war, there's increasing realization in Washington, and this precedes Trump's return to the White House. There's increasing realization that the US objective vis-a-vis Russia, far from advancing, is actually backfiring by pushing Russia and China together in an unholy alliance against America. In fact, Russia today has become a resurgent power. 3 years ago, it was a declining power. Today, it has pivoted to a war economy. Its total production of weapons and munitions is 3 times today of the combined NATO production. Now, things are not going well in the war, even for Ukraine. Ukraine is not winning, it's losing. So given those realities, Trump is trying to cut America's losses so that the US can shift its focus on the country's primary challenger. And this is not Trump's thinking. Look at Biden's national security strategy. The first strategy report came out in 2022, many months after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it said, black and white, that China is the only country with the resolve and capability to overtake the US as the world's foremost power, and that China, it said, is America's main challenger at the global level. At the global level, the US doesn't have any other challenger. Russia's interests are regional, ambitions are regional in terms of focus. So given the fact that at least there's a bipartisan consensus in Washington that China is the primary challenger to the US, it follows logically that Trump would seek to focus on China. His defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, said in Brussels in a speech 3 weeks ago or even less, that Europe needs to take care of its own security so that the US can focus on deterring China in the Indo-Pacific. There could be a more clear-cut statement from the Trump administration about Europe's own responsibility to look after its security. That is the context in which we should look at the developments that are unfolding.
So you do not believe that this focus on China could involve in the end reaching some sort of friendlier place than it appears to be right now. The reason I ask this is because it's very interesting that India has begun its own rapprochement process with China. India is part of the Quad, but India is also part of the SCO. Where do you see India in this US-China focus? Is India managing both relationships to its own interest, or does India under the Trump administration remain a strategic countervailing force to the rise of China?
First, on Trump, if you read Trump's 1987 book, The Art of the Deal, he explains his negotiating tactics. He says in his book that he blends some flattery with hardball tactics. He's a deal maker and he seeks to cut deals. So he would like to cut a deal with China. He uses flattery with every visiting leader, except Zelensky, with whom he got into a heated argument. But if you just look at all the leaders who have been to White House since Trump came back to the White House, he has sprinkled some flattery on each visitor, whether it was Modi or the Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba before Modi, or the two most recent visitors, Starmer and Macron. But even with Xi Jinping, he calls him a great leader, he's a very powerful man, etc., etc. This is all part of his negotiating strategy. He would like to cut deals with China without seeking to deviate from his strategic focus on countering China's challenge to the US global primacy. Now, in that context, India's efforts to seek a rapprochement with China that began last autumn were a result of the Biden administration exerting pressure on India. It was a result of the US-India relationship coming under strain. So India was trying to offset that scenario by seeking to mend fences with China. And China had its own strategic compulsions to mend fences with India. So it was a tactical move by India. But we know in India that India's primary challenger and primary threat is China. No government in India, whichever party might be in office in India, this is a reality that every government will face and respond to. So in that context, India, without burning its bridges with China, and it shouldn't, why should India burn its bridges with any country? It'll like to maintain, at least give the appearance of a semblance of normalcy in its relationship with China. But it's very much doing what Trump is seeking to do, which is that on one hand, you negotiate with your adversary, you cut deals, but at the same time, you don't deviate from your strategic priorities.
If Trump does cut a deal with the Chinese, where does that leave India's leverage with Washington?
India is cutting deals with China. Hasn't India cut deals with China recently of various types? So what if Trump cuts some deal or two or several deals with China? It'll be good for India because to give the appearance of the US-China relationship being stable, while at the same time the US is doing everything to contain China. That's a better strategy than to openly engage in a Cold War with China. That doesn't serve the interests of the US, doesn't serve the interests of India, because it'll also make things difficult for India's equation with China. So while having an outwardly friendly relationship with China and seeking to push your strategic interests through various means makes sense both for the US and for India.
Finally, then, let me ask you this. What do you think are the pain points that India should anticipate or manage or navigate between the US and India? There was some debate, for example, over the deportation of Indian illegal immigrants being brought back in chains. Today, we read that the military aircraft that the US had deployed, it was costing too much, they're not going to be used. On terrorism, your own comment on X pointed out that while a court has upheld the Havur Rana, the 2611, one of the 2611 key operational masterminds extradition to India, David Headley, I don't think any American government is ever going to hand him over. What do you see as the pain points in the next few months?
We can see from what happened under the Biden administration. They played the human rights card against India, then they played the Khalistan card against India. Just on the eve of Modi's visit in September last year, the White House held a briefing for Khalistan militants. They were called to the White House and briefed by senior administration and intelligence officials, so openly playing the Khalistan card. And we have seen how they have sheltered and shielded some prominent Khalistanis. So then we've had differences or major disputes on India's own immediate neighborhood. For example, America's policy toward Bangladesh, American policy towards Myanmar, which is compounding India's challenge in Manipur state, or the Biden administration policy towards Pakistan, which was to resume the coddling of Pakistan, including upgrading and modernizing Pakistan's F-16 fleet against India. Now, these were more than irritants. These were major issues that cropped up during the Biden administration. Now we have an administration in Washington that openly seeks to end the weaponization of the American justice system. It is, and as we heard from Trump when he was with Modi at the White House, that Rana's extradition to India would be the first step. And he said there are more to follow. Headley, being a double agent, may not be extradited to India, but there are other elements in the US that India wants, including this gentleman in New York who is a Khalistan advocate. So we don't know.
Do you mean Gurpatwant Pannu?
Yes, we don't know whether Pannu will be handed over to India, but certainly his use of American soil that happened during the Biden administration, using American soil or Canadian soil, he's a dual national, to make terrorist threats against India, including against Air India. That I think would become more difficult for Pannu now, that's for sure. And for example, the two arson attacks on the Indian consulate in San Francisco, those arsonists have not been brought to trial. Things are going to change for the better. What the new US policy will be towards, let's say, Pakistan or towards Bangladesh or towards Myanmar, we don't know. But I would think that if the US wants better equation with India, wishes to co-opt India in its Indo-Pacific strategy in a way that makes India more integral to this strategy, then it will allow India to actually look after its own immediate neighborhood rather than the US working in a way that is inimical to India's core interests in India's own immediate neighborhood. So I think there might be some yielding by the American side if the US wants to have a relationship with India based on mutual trust, because mutual trust is essential to create a real bonding.
Yeah. Just before we let you go briefly, there were some eyebrows raised when Trump, in his address to Congress, praised Pakistan for delivering a terrorist who was responsible for the Kabul airport bombing in which 13 US servicemen were killed. But, those who are cynical about Pakistan and watch it closely said, oh, there's Pakistan's army chief managing to ingratiate himself with the Americans again. Trump doesn't necessarily understand those nuances of Pakistan and its army and its games that closely. Did that concern you, that comment, set aside for Pakistan?
Not really, because if you would recall that Trump in his first administration ended decades-old US policy of coddling Pakistan. He halted all security assistance to Pakistan on grounds that Pakistan had not cut its links with terror groups. He was quite inimical toward Pakistan. I don't think he will pursue a friendly approach of the Biden administration type toward Pakistan. So I don't think, as you said, he may not have understood the nuance of what he was saying. He is only looking at what the US can get. He is not into issues of how it might affect Indian attitudes if he makes a statement of any kind. That's not Trump. Trump wants to show to his people at home that this is what he is getting economically, from trade deals, from security deals, and I think that will be his approach. He's transactional, but we should not forget one thing: that diplomacy, by definition, is in part transactional. And even during the Biden administration, India tried to placate Biden by signing a $3.5 billion drone deal last autumn. So India also understands that transactions in diplomacy are important to woo a partner, also important to fend off pressure. And we're going to see that in the Trump second term, India using transactions to fend off US pressure.
Thank you, Brahma Chellaney. As the Chinese would say, we live in interesting times, and thanks for your insights in helping us understand some of those seeming paradoxes and unpredictabilities. Thank you very much. Pleasure as always.
My pleasure.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.